Point Blank is a crime fiction podcast. It may not be suitable for all listeners. We discuss violence in all its forms. The works we reference may include period slang, which some listeners may find offensive. The hosts also have a tendency to swear.
Episode 19, To Have and Have Not by Ernest Hemingway. Welcome to Point Blank. My name is Kurt, and joining me, as always, here's Justin.
Hey, folks. Hi, Kurt. How's the boat been?
Been all right, both my boat and the boat at work, and it's made me think a lot about this book, To Have and Have Not, which involves a boat.
That's true. We haven't done a boat noir in a while, and while this isn't technically boat noir, it has some of those elements, and it was reminiscent or brought me back to our fourth episode when we looked at Charles Williams' work. Sort of fun to be on the water again.
Yeah, for sure. And so that was pretty exciting to me, and we'll get into that in a little bit here. But first off, I thought I would share a couple of things I've been watching or listening to. And Justin, if you have anything, you can certainly add them. But I'll start off with the film Highwaymen, which is on Netflix. That's this thing that stars Kevin Costner and Woody Harrelson as the duo of Texas Rangers who hunt down Bonnie and Clyde. Now, really, I would probably say this movie is a pass. It's gotten a lot of publicity. That's why I mention it. There's some decent scenes, and some of the dialogue between Costner and Harrelson is pretty decent. But overall, as a movie, I thought it was pretty boring. And I didn't really like how they left Bonnie and Clyde almost completely off the screen and really didn't talk about that at all. You know, if you're looking for a couple hours of just easy entertainment, you could go for this one. But otherwise, I would give that a pass. The second thing on Netflix that I just recently watched is The Treasure of Cocaine Island. And this is an actual... Yeah. It's
a great title.
It is a great title. And I have to say, this was a lot of fun. It's a documentary. And it's a documentary that's shot in this... It's got this cool editing style that's like sort of... I don't know. It made me think of part James Bond, part Hunter S. Thompson, part Guy Ritchie in the way that it was done. And they interview a lot of the people who were actually involved in this case. And what happens is that this older guy, normal American dude, who learns about this stash of cocaine that's supposed to be on an island off of Puerto Rico. And he gets it in his head that he's going to go get it. It's worth $2 million. He's like, oh, this will be easy money. He really bumbles around with the people that he involves himself with. And I won't give up most of the story because it is worth watching. But needless to say, a lot of misadventures come out. And about, even pretty soon in the documentary, you're going to be like, well, why is this guy even like telling this story? And once you know that, it almost makes it more interesting because you're like, well, what's going to happen here that allows him to freely talk about this in the documentary? And of course, it's a group of people from South Florida. So you've got a little Florida man elements to this as well.
Oh, yeah. They get around.
It's an entertaining documentary. One of the more colorful, fun documentaries I've watched in a long time. So that's The Treasure of Cocaine Island.
Sounds like a real stupid mystery in the making, but glad to hear that the documentary actually was an enjoyable experience. I recently subscribed to the Criterion channel, which is a brand new channel and a replacement for Filmstruck, and it's been fun, the build up to it, and it finally went live last week. And the first film I saw was The Fabulous Baron Munchausen, which is a 1962 film, I believe, that was later redone by one of the Monty Python guys, Gilliam. But this original was absolutely stupendous. It was surreal and imaginative and visually stunning, and I highly recommend it to anybody who has not seen that film. I can see it as a template for so much modern and postmodern cinema. It has so many of the pieces that I see now in folks like, my wife was saying, Wes Anderson, not to mention the Monty Python crew, and everybody in between who plays with surrealism and plays with visuals in an interesting or imaginative way. So that's been fun, and I hope I can binge watch international film for the next few months, but it seems like my work keeps getting in the way of it.
But I didn't know that there was an earlier version of Munchausen. I'm gonna have to track that down and watch it because I love the other version.
Yeah, this was impressive. It was really, really recommended. Oh, that reminds me, we forgot to mention this. We do have a couple Patreon backers finally, and we appreciate it, and we wanted to give a shout out to them. Our old comrade Jeff, and also Marilyn. Thank you for backing the show in the past few months. We do appreciate it. We're not rich yet, but it does feel nice to have a little bit of support from y'all. Helps to offset some of the costs we have here running this podcast, paying for all the behind the scenes stuff. So thank you for that, Jeff and Marilyn.
Yes, thank you very much. And we are going to be sort of editing our pledge levels here soon. We're looking at things like, if you give a certain pledge, you could give us some ideas and we'll write up a very stupid mystery series for you. I'll take recommendations for our well-thumbed classics section if you'd like to suggest a particular book. And there may be other goals coming up as well. So pay attention to that.
Totally. Once we hone down exactly what those are going to be, we'll make an announcement. We'll send it out on Facebook, and we'll repeat it here on the show. So you won't be unclear on what the options are available to you. So we'll figure that out in the next month.
Yeah. And before we move into talking about Hemingway here, I had two podcasts that I've been listening to for years, and I don't believe I've ever mentioned it on the show. And the other is a short, newer one. The first one is that short one. It's called Neon Noir, and there's only 8 episodes. And basically, these are shorts that are audio dramas, mostly modern style noir, and they're all right. I would recommend them. You can listen to all the episodes in a relatively short amount of time. Say doing one major cleaning project around the house. They're well produced and the writing's pretty decent, and you might want to check that out. That's Neon Noir. And the other one, and this is one I can't believe I haven't mentioned on the show before, because I've been listening to this I don't know, probably for 10 years. There's something like 300 and some episodes of Decoder Ring Theater, and it's audio drama. About half of them are a character called the Red Panda, and that's more of like a classic era superhero thing. But the other half are episodes of Blackjack Justice, and that is an old school PI type story. And like I said, there's like 150 episodes of this going back. They're well produced. They have different voice actors doing the different characters, and you could get a lot of listening out of that. And it's been a go-to podcast to me for years and years. And they've really stopped making new episodes now, but there's such a back catalog that is still available. I would highly recommend checking that out.
Sounds good.
All right, so let's move into talking, or at least introducing, our book for these next 2 episodes here, Ernest Hemingway's To Have and Have Not. Would you like to give us a little summary of this book, Justin?
I'm going to give you a medium short summary. These tend to stretch long, especially when I have so much to say. But before I dive in, could you, in 2 sentences, give me your impression of this book? Did it meet your impressions? Did it defy what you expected?
Well,
that's a good start.
There's a lot to talk about in this book. That is clear. I think it's worth reading because it's Ernest Hemingway and because there are some interesting things going on in this book. However, I recommend this book with reservations. It's definitely not a perfect book, and it's by far the book that, of the main topics that we've looked at, this one has the most racist language in a lot of it, and that is a little bit of a trouble spot for me in points. But that said, there's a lot of things going on here that are worth talking about.
Definitely. All right, that seems reasonable. So let me dive in here. This is my short review. I'm going to go longer in the next episode as we go for our deep dive, but let's just get the ball rolling. So, Ernest Hemingway, we all know him in some capacity and his work, but not many of us know this book, To Have and Have Not. It's not one of his top-tier works. It's not even his second-tier works. This was published in 1937, and it tells the story of Harry Morgan, a fisherman and boat captain who, essentially to make ends meet for his family in Key West, gets involved in bootlegging and human smuggling between the Keys and Cuba. The novel is interesting in terms of its form, and this is one of the things that really caught my eye the first time I read it. The novel is broken into 3 parts, and each of these parts takes on a slightly different form and point of view. And I feel as if Hemingway is attempting to channel some internal William Faulkner or James Joyce or something to play with form in this way that he doesn't often do in his work. It's hard to say, though, because he doesn't really talk about his writing, or he didn't before he passed away. It's hard to point a finger at this novel and say precisely what Hemingway wanted it to be. Is it hard-boiled? Yes. It is easily Hemingway's most hard-boiled novel. The violence comes hard and fast. The dialogue is sharp, terse, simple, full of wisecracks and repetition. One of the critics I read likened the dialogue to bursts from a Tommy gun. Speaking of, are there Tommy guns in this novel? Yes. Now, I said 3 parts. Here are the 3 parts. Part 1 is hard-boiled adventure. It's springtime and we find Harry Morgan in a Havana bar drinking Bacardi as he is accosted by young Cuban revolutionaries seeking to charter a boat for a human smuggling operation to the Florida Keys. Harry turns him down. Moments later, men in a car open fire on the rebels and on the cafe, and it's a bloody sort of mess. Instead of smuggling young revolutionaries, Morgan takes a wealthy white man out on the Gulf Stream to fish for marlin, which is Harry's occupation at the time. He's a fisherman, and he takes people out. Here we get some of the class themes that are pretty strong in this book, stronger than in a lot of Hemingway's work. And the rich white man, he's a demanding incompetent. He fails to catch anything, and then he loses Morgan's prized and expensive fishing gear due to negligence, essentially. The man shirks paying his bill after this, which adds insult to injury, leaving Morgan stranded and broke in the middle of the Great Depression in Havana. He's got a wife and kids back in Key West, like I mentioned, and now we see him having to compromise his scruples to make ends meet. He sets up a deal with a Chinese man named Mr. Singh, or a friend sets it up, and this is going to be a smuggling operation of some Chinese people to the Keys. But this ends up being another messy situation. Morgan kills Mr. Singh by strangling him barehanded, sinks his body in the Gulf Stream, then releases the people he was supposed to smuggle just a few miles down the shore back in Cuba, not far from where he picked them up. This is sort of the end of part 1. We get part 2. All of a sudden, we're in fall, and Harry Morgan and his boatmate, Wesley, who happens to be a black man, which is important and we'll talk about that more later. They're hiding in the mangroves in the Keys with a boat full of bootlegged liquor. So at this point, we're in the future, and Harry is clearly doing smuggling on a regular basis. Now, just for the record, Hemingway, through the character of Harry Morgan, uses the N-word early and often in this novel. We're going to talk about it later, but I just have to say this. If this is an absolute deal breaker for you, I suggest you avoid this book. I'm not saying he uses it once or twice. It's dozens and dozens of times. So, that being said, the men are hiding in the mangroves. They're bleeding from bullet wounds because the deal with the rum went bad. A boat approaches. The folks on the boat, there are some D.C. bureaucrats, but also a man who is a local boat captain. And this captain knows Morgan and refuses to squeal to the authorities, despite the protests of these bureaucrats who want to bust Harry Morgan. So this shows a little bit of this local loyalty versus the big bureaucracy, government, whatever. Now, all of a sudden, we're at part 3. We're less than 100 pages into the book, and we're already into the third and last part. This part is 170 pages long, and there's a reason for that. This is a novella, essentially, that Hemingway wrote after he wrote the first 2 sections, which he published in reputable publications as short stories. So, I mean, in terms of looking at this book as to what Hemingway wanted it to be, what was his plan, you could say maybe he's a mastermind, a genius. You could also say that he was just stitching together some work he had, and he never quite figured out how to do it. Jury's still out. Anyway, part 3 we're in winter, and Harry Morgan's boat is locked up by the authorities. At some point, he finally got busted for the bootlegging. He has also lost an arm after that incident in part 2 with the gunfire in his injured body. So in this section, we get a good sense of the town of Key West, the down-and-out denizens and the aimless vets facing the hard realities of the Depression, along with the 1% visiting the Keys in their yachts from places further north. The section starts with a chapter where Albert is the POV character. This is a new character to us in the story, and he's the main POV character in this small part. Then he's not. It's just a weird move that Hemingway makes. Later, we move into Harry's third person, but then we shift again to a new group of characters, the aforementioned wealthy yachting class. Plot-wise, Harry gets offered a job by a new group of young Cuban men, brokered by a lawyer named B-Lips, which is likely to be our Puss Walgreen this time. I mean, it's got to be that. The men want to be smuggled into Cuba. Harry needs the money, and he takes the job. That seems to be one of the big themes of this book. Harry needs money, so he has to do what it takes. He has to do what it takes to get it. En route to Cuba, one of the trigger-happy robbers / revolutionaries kills Harry's friend Albert. This sets off Harry, who gets all hard-boiled and avenges the death of his friend. Gets pretty violent. Over the course of this conflagration, Harry gets shot. There's much talk of revolution and power and class and wealth and ends justifying means and other things that make this book interesting and somewhat important. While Harry is avenging Albert, his wife Marie, who we haven't talked about yet, and we should because she's one of the more interesting characters in the story, she's at home with her kids waiting for him. She's not feeling worried about him. Rich people like this guy, Richard Gordon, who we see a lot of, and Helene Bradley, they're cheating on each other, drinking heavily, generally being presented as morally bankrupt lost souls. Then the end. The end is dark. Our friend, our hero, or is he an anti-hero? Or is he just an asshole? Harry Morgan. He dies from his injuries. His wife, Marie, wonders how she'll get along with kids she doesn't even care about. And the rich people are still rich and depressed. 20 years after the release of this novel, Fidel Castro and Ernesto Guevara invade Cuba and overthrow Batista. 20 years after that, legions of Jimmy Buffett worshipping parrot heads invade Key West. This is a weird book. I like it, but it has some serious problems. I like to think about it, though, and I want to talk about this in a great detail with you, Kurt. I can't say I love this book, though. I'm going to give it 3.75 hits.
Okay, 3.75. Yeah, I can see that. I think for me, I'm gonna not waffle on this opinion this time. This is a 3.
Okay.
For me, it's a 3, but it's a 3 that's worth reading because, like you said, there is a lot of interesting things going on in this book. I think where it fails for me is I see that Hemingway is playing with structure here, but I think it doesn't quite work. There's a lot for such a short book. There's a lot of holes in both the plot and the characterization. I'm not really a fan of how he, especially in part 3, gets into these sort of story within the story elements and breaks that up with what's going on with Harry Morgan. I understand what he's trying to do. I see it, but it was done very inelegantly in my eyes.
Oh, I can see that.
And I think there's a lot of things going on here that, like I said, are worth talking about. But I also think when we get into the biography of Hemingway, we'll see that this was the time that this was released. There was a lot of stuff going on in Hemingway's life, which, as you sort of said, he might have kind of been looking for something to stitch together and get a book out there to possibly just get the paycheck. And I think there's some of that going on in this book as well. But it is still Hemingway. It is certainly a notable hard-boiled story, and I think it's worth looking at because of what it does possibly for future writers, and that's something worth talking about.
Definitely, and I do look forward to that. There's so much, but before we do that, we're going to take a step back and deviate and head up to the Great Lakes for just a short time for our featured review. Is that right, Kurt?
Yes, that's right. We're going to be going to Milwaukee, which really is sort of connected to Hemingway because Hemingway was, of course, born in Illinois and spent some of his time stomping around the Midwest, more Michigan than Wisconsin. But
that's true. But they're all Great Lakes states. They're all Michigan bordering.
Sure. So we are looking at a book that actually pretty close to the release of this episode is going to be a new release, and this is something new for us. We're looking at Milwaukee Noir. This was edited by Tim Hennessy, and this is one of the global noir books of Akashic Books. It's going to be released on May 7th of 2019, so you can look for that. So what we've got here is a collection of 14 stories centered around Milwaukee, and really written by a diversity of authors that sort of reflects the population of Milwaukee. And, Justin and I have mentioned in the past that we are fans of this sort of Rust Belt noir. We got that from North and Central when we were read that one, and we're looking at Chicago.
Yeah.
And Milwaukee is a place that doesn't really come up in fiction very often, yet for me, it's a fascinating place. It's a very blue collar city. It's the home of Miller Brewing. It's one of its most famous claim to fame, of Harley Davidson motorcycles. It's industrial. It's the home of Summerfest, which is, I believe, still claimed to be the world's largest music festival. And yet Milwaukee has both this good side and this bad side. It has these strong neighborhoods, a lot of different ethnic communities, and it celebrates those communities. But Milwaukee is also, I believe, the most segregated city in the country. It has a very big problem with its police department, and there's issues of gentrification and the downside of industrialism. But for me, Milwaukee was always, I grew up in Northeast Wisconsin, and Milwaukee was probably the first big city that I was ever in. I mean, Chicago was there, but Milwaukee was first. And yep. Chicago was sort of a real big city, like a New York or an LA, or at least in my mind as a child. But Milwaukee was more of, this is what the all-American big city is. So for me, Milwaukee has always had kind of an interesting spot in my brain. So it was really interesting to see this collection of writing, which I really enjoyed. And I don't know, how did you think about it, Justin?
I liked it. With these Akashic book collections, these noir, geographically focused noir books, you get a lot of good stories, and you get a handful of stories that you might not love, and that's the same with this collection. But I'll say this collection starts really strong. The first three stories I was just captivated, and there were a few more that really held my interest and moved me. I'll talk about those in a little bit, but I did like the variety. And some of these noir collections, you'll get stories in a city, but a lot of the sort of regional specifics for each story, a lot of them are just sort of the same. There's not really much distinction, but there's a lot of distinction in the geography, be it terrain like Earth geography, or also like the racial geography and the class geography of Milwaukee. You get the posh suburbs, you get the green lawns, but you also get the hard streets and the grindhouse cinemas. You get all that Rust Belt flavor that really, I feel, fits for noir, but you also get racial tensions, and you see the racist policies and the segregation and how that translates in people's lives. And that stuff is really important to see, and you don't see it often. And it's really nice to see somebody just turning the spotlight on a city that often gets forgotten or overlooked in favor of Chicago, and even in the Midwest, Minneapolis. So I was just really happy to read it, and I did overall enjoy what Hennessy put together.
Yeah, I did too, and as you said, these collections sometimes, they could be kind of removed and set somewhere else, and it wouldn't really make a difference. But I did feel that these stories captured Milwaukee, and maybe that's because for both of us, we're a little bit more familiar with the area and the city. But I do think that Milwaukee is such a good place to look at for a lot of the issues that are going on in America, because it has a lot of good things and a lot of bad things going on. And I think that's one of the reasons why, not too long ago, the Democratic National Convention decided that they're going to be holding their next conference in Milwaukee.
Interesting.
Yeah, they're picking a city where I think there's going to be some very, Milwaukee has some big problems, and they're trying to solve those problems. But it's a city where politically here, the Democrats will be looking at those things and focusing on those things. And I believe, a collection like this highlights some of the things that are going on in a city like Milwaukee. And it's really, to me, Milwaukee has always been a city that sort of is a microcosm of what's going on in the rest of America.
I could totally see that. I feel like Chicago has the same problems, and I grew up outside of Chicago, and Chicago was my first city, and I came to understand and know Milwaukee a little bit better later in life in my 20s when I was living in Wisconsin. But Milwaukee has all the big city problems that Chicago does, but I feel like they have them. It has them on a more manageable scale, a scale that could be better dissected and understood in the form of story or other analysis. And I feel like it is a great sort of test in the case of the DNC coming there, and a great place to confront these issues that we have that cities in the Rust Belt face now at this sort of turning point or pivot as to the past and the future. What kind of city can these places become? Chicago is so huge and so massive and so convoluted that it's hard to see how to fix things like that. Whereas Milwaukee, I feel like it's a little more manageable.
From the stories in this collection, Justin, do you have any highlights?
Yes, I do. I mentioned early on, I like the first 3 stories a lot. Valerie Lakin's Runoff. It's a story about some kids wandering in the tunnels beneath the city. They learn some lessons about what rich people keep behind closed doors. I liked Matthew J. Prigg's 3rd Street Waltz, which is about one man's mission to end an era of grindhouse cinemas with a film no one will forget. I thought that was a fun insider's look at the grindhouse cinema scene, which I'm not very familiar with. And of course, Reed Farrell Coleman, who's a well-known crime author. He's been around for years. He's written a lot of good stuff. He did Summerfest 76, which takes us into aforementioned Summerfest, Kurt. And, I remember my first time to Summerfest, getting drunk and stoned and like watching Pat Benatar and not knowing, I'm like, what is this weird place? This is a story about the kind of doomed love that finds its foothold at Milwaukee's outdoor music institution and how that doesn't really go well in the long run. There's one more I have to mention because it's a great story and it's a great author, Larry Watson, who, if you don't know him, he actually taught at Stevens Point for years, and also he's been teaching at Marquette, or at least he was for a while. But he wrote a novel called Montana 1948, which came out in 1993, and I really loved that novel. And I didn't know he had a Milwaukee connection until I saw his name in this book. So really cool to see that story. I really enjoyed Night Clerk, about a dying man who offers to kill a lonely night clerk's worst enemy. And of course, that can't go right, can it? So those are my big 4. Did you have any stories in here, these ones or others that really stood out to you?
Well, I have to say I agree with you on those 4. Those are really strong stories. I particularly liked that Valerie Lakin's story Runoff that leads out the book. That was really, really good. And the Summerfest one always just made me thought of this local joke. There's such a thing as the Summerfest baby, and 9 months after Summerfest, you have a uptick in perhaps unwanted children.
I guess you can do it anywhere.
Yeah, but all of those were really solid. The other one that I thought was good because this did capture true events that have happened in Milwaukee is that this one by Derek Harnell, I think, and it's there's a riot going on.
Yeah,
and that one addresses some of the issues of the police brutality that have happened in Milwaukee and the response by the community. That's been a big issue in Milwaukee, like most of America. But I enjoyed that story as well, and how it dealt with particularly the inner dialogue of the character and how he was thinking about what his place in having a voice was. It ends kind of darkly, but it does make you think.
Cool. Yeah, I did like that one too. And there were a few more I liked, but I'm not going to name them all. I do encourage folks to pick up this book if they have any interest in Milwaukee Noir or just regional noir. Milwaukee's not on the map very often. So if you want to get an insider's take on a real beautiful city that doesn't get the attention that it sometimes, I think, deserves, check out Hennessy's edited collection of Milwaukee Noir through Akashic Books.
Hennessy did a good job of collecting some quality stories here, and it is definitely worth your time. Well, before we get into to have and have not, we're going to look at a little bit into the biography of Ernest Hemingway, and of course, here we have the challenge that there's more written about Ernest Hemingway than probably every author we have looked at and will look at for a while combined. Certainly one of the most influential authors of the 20th century. So we'll just try to get some highlights here, and particularly some things that might be relevant to this book in particular, to have and have not. So let's start out. Hemingway was born July 21st, 1899 in Oak Park, Illinois. And he would famously die on July 2nd, 1961 in Ketchum, Idaho, of a self-inflicted gunshot wound. His mother was Grace Hall Hemingway. She was an opera singer, and his father was Clarence Edwards Hemingway, and he was a doctor. So Hemingway's childhood, it was definitely a life of a certain amount of privilege. And by the time of the end of Hemingway's life, he has countless short stories, numerous novels, but probably most importantly, he won a Pulitzer Prize for fiction in 1953 and a Nobel Prize in literature in 1954. He starts out with a good education in Oak Park, Illinois. He has music lessons. He gets to spend family summer trips in Michigan, where he would learn to hunt, fish, and camp, themes which, of course, come up numerous times in his fiction. In high school, he would participate in sports such as boxing, track and field, water polo, and football. He excelled in English, which should probably be no surprise, and he got his start in journalism by working on the school paper and the yearbook. He leaves high school, and then he goes and briefly works for the Kansas City Star. Now, this would be a brief job, but there's a certain part of his style which he adapted from this early job, and that is the style guide that they were using at the newspaper. It was to use short sentences, use short first paragraphs, use vigorous English, and be positive, not negative. At the early age of 18, we start getting into the Hemingway that sort of creates the legend of Ernest Hemingway. And World War I is breaking out. Hemingway tries to join the U.S. Army, the Navy, the Marines, and he's rejected by all of them over his eyesight. But like so many of the writers that we've looked at from this period, he wants to get involved in the war. So he volunteers for the Red Cross, and he becomes an ambulance driver in the Italian front. And almost from day one, he sees violence and war firsthand. This material would become, part of all of his writing, but particularly Death in the Afternoon. During this time, he would see casualties, both military casualties and civilian casualties, be affected by that. He himself would be injured by mortar fire, and he would receive the Italian Silver Medal of Bravery for his actions as an ambulance driver. After the war, he goes back to the U.S., and he spends some time in Michigan recovering by hunting, camping, and fishing. And then he gets a job for the Toronto Star as a reporter. He would also marry his first wife during this time. And then he gets sent as a foreign correspondent, and he's off to Paris. And this would really basically change his life, because he's exposed to tons of writers and artists. I mean, basically anybody who's anybody in this time frame spends at least a little bit of time in Paris. He would file stories following the Greco-Turkish War during this time frame. He would write travel pieces, and it's from these relationships that he develops in Paris that he writes his first novel, The Sun Also Rises. His first marriage would end, and this is a reoccurring theme. He gets married almost immediately to Pauline Pfeiffer. In the late 20s, he would move back to the United States, and that's kind of when he ends up in Key West, which is, of course, crucial to our story. He's writing both journalism and short stories during this time frame. Around this same time, his father commits suicide, and we'll see that is a major trend in his family and also leads to his untimely demise. He's working on the novel A Farewell to Arms at this point. He's traveling back and forth to Europe. He's spending a lot of time in Spain, and then which promotes him to work on the book Death in the Afternoon, which is about bullfighting in Spain, another one of his more famous books. Of course, almost all Hemingway is famous. He formally buys a house in Key West in 1931, and I thought this was interesting aside. It was across the street from the lighthouse, which made it easier for him to stumble drunkenly home after a night of binge drinking.
Sounds about right.
Yeah, it does. It's here he gets into fishing, very hardcore deep sea fishing, which of course comes up in Old Man and the Sea and various other works. In the mid-30s, he's going on safaris to Africa, and he buys his boat Pilar in 1934. And of course, this is about the same time that he's working on To Have and To Have Not, at least the first two sections of To Have and Have Not. During this time, this novel that we're talking about is sort of formulating or possibly formulating in his head. And in early 1937, he agrees to report on the Spanish Civil War. And he's pretty much a supporter of the Republican side from day one. And over there, he's exposed to more leftist ideals and Marxist thought. And a lot of people say, and I think we'll see that in this particular novel, that comes through. There's a lot of talk of revolutionaries. There's a lot of talk about class issues and those sorts of things. It's also in Spain where he would meet his now third wife, Martha Gellhorn, who is actually probably one of the greatest war correspondents of the 20th century. Her writing is especially good. She's also a novelist as well. Meeting her would end his second marriage, and I think you can also see elements of that in To Have and To Have Not. Hemingway would stay in Spain until almost the bitter end. He would be present at the Battle of Ebro, which was the last stand of the Republican forces in 1938. In 1939, he starts going to Cuba. Of course, this is after the writing of this book, so to keep that in mind, because Cuba is an important part of Hemingway's life. And he gets a house in Cuba. Finca Vigia, is that how you say that, Justin?
That sounds right. I'm not 100%.
Okay, well, we'll go with Finca Vigia. That is the name of his home in Cuba, and he works on For Whom the Bell Tolls, which was inspired by the Spanish Civil War. In 1941, he goes to China with Martha to do some reporting, and this is where this gets interesting. I think Hemingway's connection to Marxism, communist Cuba, and the Soviet Union is really fascinating to me when you put it in context to the idea that Hemingway is sort of this American man's man writer, and you have all these people who, they kind of want to dismiss his lefty leanings when they talk about him. But when he was in China, he may have been recruited by the Soviet Union to work as a spy. And there's some evidence of this. His code name, if this is true, was Agent Argo. Huh. And then he returns. This is towards, of course, World War II has broken out. He converts his fishing boat to hunt for U-boats off the coast of Cuba, as you do if you're Ernest Hemingway. I think he put some various anti-sub weapons on his boat, and I don't know that he ever sunk anything, but that's Ernest Hemingway for you. Then he gets dispatched to Europe to cover the war. He's there for the Normandy landings, the liberation of Paris, and the Battle of the Bulge. He did spend he was sick during a lot of this time, so he didn't get as much frontline reporting time as he may have liked. But in a famous story about Ernest Hemingway, he was also tried for violations of the Geneva Convention.
Huh.
At least for a part of this time, Hemingway supposedly led a group of French resistance militia fighters, and he was brought up on formal charges. This is the sort of thing maybe you get away with when you're Ernest Hemingway and you're on the winning side of a war. But those charges were dropped after he said, well, he was just providing advice.
He's teaching him how to fish.
Yeah. I would suspect that Hemingway was actually leading this militia group. He also, I can't remember if this is during World War II, the Spanish Civil War, but he famously asked a soldier for his gun while he was doing a reporting so he could take some shots at some fascists. So Hemingway was certainly not pro-fascism.
Yeah.
That is one of the things we can say that's nice about Ernest Hemingway. During World War II, he would receive a Bronze Star, which I didn't know that they actually gave those to civilians, but he got that for bravely depicting the lives of frontline soldiers. And then after the war, he's back in Cuba with a new wife now, Mary, And it's really after, it's in the 50s here where his life is starting to, I guess, kind of fall apart. Depression starts to set in. He's in multiple accidents, car accidents and whatnot, including 2 plane crashes that happened in Africa.
Yeah.
And yeah, his body is really starting to show the miles, as you might say. He writes Old Man and the Sea, and for that he wins the Pulitzer Prize in 1952. It's after, I believe, the second plane crash where there were reports that he had died in the crash that got out in the media. And in 1954, he wins that Nobel Prize for Literature. And Hemingway felt that it was quite possible that he got the Nobel Prize because people thought he had died and that they wanted to recognize him while he was still alive. That was how he viewed his Nobel Prize win. He does continue to write, putting together some collections and getting into some of his older work that's been re-edited during this time, but he is really dealing with a lot of pain and a lot of depression that hampers his work and causes medical problems. Also, his heavy drinking is catching up with him. Part of his mental health issues involved issues that he was extremely worried about money and his safety. I don't know exactly why he was concerned about his safety, but we do know that the FBI was keeping a file on him during all of this time. He does start to get some treatment for his physical ailments and for his depression. However, of course, the treatment in that time frame was a little bit crude, and it doesn't really seem to help. So on July 2nd, in 1961, he would die of a self-inflicted gunshot wound using his favorite shotgun, and it was initially ruled as accidental. This would change in later years, that it was a suicide. You know, I always knew that Hemingway had committed suicide, but what I didn't know is that he had a condition remember, his father committed suicide. He also had a brother and a sister who killed themselves, and they all suffered from a condition called hemochromatosis, which means that you can't metabolize iron. And that leads to both problems of healing from his injuries, and it causes depression. Now, I did not look up to see if we have a treatment for that today, but I would imagine we have something. But unfortunately, that's, what really, this hemochromatosis is what really contributed to his death.
You know what? I just looked it up. Treatments for hemochromatosis include therapeutic phlebotomy, iron chelation therapy, dietary changes, and treatment for complications. It looks like there is no cure, but treatments can reduce the amount of iron in your body and help to relieve symptoms. The likelihood is that there's probably more treatments now than there were during the time of Hemingway and his family. Obviously, this genetic heritage is sort of depressing and unfortunate. It's too bad that that might be one of the reasons why things went badly so quickly for him after all of these injuries, in addition to the drinking and the hard living and all that. What a life. He lived hard, and he lived in a time of world history that was really interesting. He was there for both world wars, and he didn't skirt around them. He was a player in both. He experienced them deeply. He fought, or at least semi-participated in the Spanish Civil War. He was in the thick of it during a time when a lot of change happened, and we were, I believe, despite all his critiques we could make toward him, the things we could point out about what he did wrong and who he was and how he treated women and his general behavior, I'm still really glad that we are able to have his writing about this time, his chronicle, his interpretation of these times, because I think he does a really good job.
Is Hemingway somewhat overrated? Yeah, probably. There's probably too much devotion to this particular author, at least in my opinion, compared to other authors.
For sure.
But is it still worth the time? Yes, it certainly is.
Cool. Well, thanks for that bio. It was thorough, and I know a good bit about Hemingway, but that was presented in a way that helped to clarify some things, and they'll be helpful in better understanding who he is when we discuss to have and have not, and also the topic of both of our subject unknowns, starting with the one we're going to do in just a moment.
Subject unknown.
Subject unknown. We're going to start this subject unknown with a little bit of a monologue by me. I have some notes on Hemingway and his use of the N-word, and we wanted to focus on this topic because to have and have not contains dozens upon dozens of uses of the N-word and other racial epithets, along with many incidences of white on other prejudice and stereotyping. And even if we are to consider the context in which the book was written, the question remains, why did Hemingway make these choices? What does this say about him as a writer, and what does it say about him as a person? That said, I've read other Hemingway. I've read most of his oeuvre, including his short stories, and as far as I remember, nowhere does he use racial epithets to the extent that he does in this novel. That's what I felt when I read it. That's what I felt when I reread it. Was this a particularly racist time for Hemingway? Was he distracted out of his concern to emphasize issues of class in the novel, having recently come back from fighting, or he wrote this before, during Spanish Civil War? Was this some personal stuff in his life that was happening? Or was he trying to do what he does best, which is to tell it like it is? And if so, is this how it was? So, a lot of questions with not many answers. I didn't want to merely speculate on the issue. I wanted evidence, and for this I refer heavily to a master's thesis I dug up from 1978 titled Depiction of Blacks in the Works of Ernest Hemingway, which was written by Sheila Marie Foer at Eastern Illinois University. She notes that Ralph Ellison and other notable writers of the time accused Hemingway of ignoring the plight of blacks in his work. So Foer took it upon herself to examine most of Hemingway's catalog. Was Ellison correct, or was he overstating his case? Turns out the work that is most egregious in its stereotyping and prejudice against blacks and others in Hemingway's work is To Have and Have Not. We happen to hit the gold mine of racism here. And most of the offense comes out of the mouth and action of our hero, Harry Morgan. So, here's a question I ask, and this is a question that Foer asks, and I'm essentially quoting her. A question Foer asks is this: does an author's sole responsibility rest in how they use their writing to promote social betterment? If so, the charge against Hemingway of social irresponsibility in his use of racial epithets might seem justified. However, on the other hand, what if an artist's responsibility depends on whatever it is they have to offer? It could be aesthetic appreciation, technical awareness, social betterment. If so, then the charge of social irresponsibility is irrelevant. So really, it's a question, what is the responsibility of an author? Critic John Atkins notes, the basis of Hemingway's early writing is a total renunciation of all social frameworks. In other words, Hemingway is not known for, nor has he ever claimed to be, a writer writing for the sake of social betterment. Somebody like John Steinbeck might be more in that category, writing Grapes of Wrath and other things. So I think it's important to look at the text itself, and I'm using again Foer here for her analysis. The story opens with Harry Morgan. He's at the Pearl of San Francisco Cafe in Cuba. This is when the people come to the cafe, the revolutionaries. Then the car drives up and two revolutionaries come out. One is white, one is black. They begin shooting. Although the revolutionaries are equally guilty of the murders, Harry's final comment on the scene is indicative of his vision. He says, "Some N-word," as he's looking down on the black man who's deceased. The main function of the black man in this scene, says Foer, as well as in the scenes to come, is to elicit responses from Morgan, responses which, for the most part, are totally prejudiced. This happens over and over again in the story. An incident occurs, and Morgan focuses his attention on a person of color in the scene and says something prejudiced about them. It can't be a coincidence that this happens, given the frequency with which it happens. A couple more examples. Following the shootings that start the story, Harry is hired by the wealthy white guy for the sea fishing expedition. They take Eddie, who's a rummy, as they say in the story, and also a black man who goes unnamed for purposes of baiting the fishing poles. The description of the black man reduces him to only a person who baits, and Harry Morgan makes it clear that he's not a good baiter, which reduces him to essentially nothing, no name, no function. And this type of stuff, this reduction of people's purpose, function, existence as having any value at all, recurs and recurs. It happens in part 2 with Harry and this guy Wesley, who's on his boat with them, who happens to be a black man. He's the only black man so far with a name, and they're both shot and injured. And Morgan comes close to actually being sympathetic for Wesley because they're both injured and suffering. They're like wounded comrades, and not just the stereotypic black man who doesn't have a function or a name or an individuality. But as soon as they get through their short situation and they know that they're going to be coming out of it in some form or fashion, Harry reverts back to his sort of prejudiced self. He says, I'm not going to take a rummy or an N-word on any ship in the future. And I got to have somebody I can depend on. This is after they almost get close to having an interaction that's human, and then he creates this distance again. So I want to do one more example before we wrap up. For one, we never see Wesley again, which is weird. And we'll talk about that in terms of form, because there's a lot of characters that come and go in this story that just sort of disappear. And I'm sure you saw that as well, Kurt. But Four concludes that while Hemingway does use stereotypes, he does not do so at the expense of black folks, except perhaps in this book, To Have and Have Not, where Wesley and other folks are treated degradingly repeatedly. Nevertheless, even here, the prejudiced attitudes expressed are those of Harry Morgan, not Hemingway necessarily. And Morgan is clearly a bigoted white murderer. That's Four's words. And you know what? I agree. They're not Hemingway, they're Morgan, but Morgan is our hero. Or is he? And that's really the question I have for this story. For all of its prejudice, for all of his attitudes toward people of color, toward Mr. Singh, toward pretty much anyone in any direction who happens to be unlike him, he's a bigot and he's self-centered and he does things ruthlessly against these folks. So here's the deal. I'm not going to apologize for Hemingway's use of the N-word or his prejudiced depiction of black folks and other minorities. He made choices, and these were his choices to make, and he did them, and that's on him. I recognize he may have made these choices to show that even so-called heroes can be terrible racists, or simply to document the reality that he lived in, but seeing as he wasn't one to comment on his own fiction, we can never know for sure. So I'm going to conclude here, and then we can talk briefly, Kurt. To end, Hemingway was not a moralist. He never ascribed to that. That was never his mode of writing or thinking about fiction. Critic Atkins writes, Hemingway put down what he saw, just like Conrad did, who is another person who gets called a racist for what he crafted in his work. But also, Hemingway wrote about what he heard. His subject was society, and although he influenced society, this was a byproduct, for his intention had been artistic, not moralistic. Now, I get that. I buy into that argument to an extent. But look at what Hemingway had to say about class in this book. He didn't hide his critique of the rich. So it isn't like he refuses to ever engage in social commentary. What was he trying to say through the words and actions of Harry Morgan? I don't have an answer. And Hemingway doesn't give answers. But if we want a more nuanced portrait of Hemingway's racist attitudes or attitudes toward race, I suggest you read pretty much anything else he's ever written, because this is the epitome of the worst he's ever done when it comes to race. So, I mean, I was surprised, but it felt good to get that confirmation, because this book, whenever I read it, it's unsettling. It's weird to read this type of stuff and know that other writers at the time that Hemingway wrote, including a lot of writers that we have read or critiqued on this show, Dashiell Hammett, James M. Cain, all these big players, they were writing around this time, and they weren't just tearing it up, saying the N-word left and right. So there was a choice to be made. What do you think, Kurt?
As you said, it's unsettling, and I was not familiar with this book before. I think you gave me this book a while back, maybe a year or two ago, and I had read it once, and then I reread it for the show. And the first time I read it, I had the same reaction that I looked at an academic paper here by just a second. I looked at a academic paper here called Reading Hemingway's To Have and Have Not by Kirk Kernet. And one of the responses that he has to this book is that when he first read this, he stopped reading it at a point fairly early in the book because he's like, well, that's not my Hemingway. That was kind of my reaction when I first read this book, is that language to me was sort of like, wait a minute, I didn't know that Hemingway wrote like this. Mm-hmm. And it was a shock. It is unsettling. And that said, it was still done, obviously. It's there on the page. If he was trying to do something by using that language, it certainly fails on the modern reader.
Yes. There
is a couple of things that throw me with his use of that language. And one is that there's a ton of social commentary in this book. I mean, the entire book is essentially a commentary on class. It's very odd to see that without at least some other commentary on race as well. Because, I mean, usually the two tend to go hand in hand.
Mm-hmm.
So that's odd. And then there's also, when he gets into the most preachy part of the book, which I also thought was kind of odd for Hemingway, it's in the very last part of the book, where basically they're looking at all the rich people's yacht, how the rich people are having problems or whatnot. You know, he gets into the happiest family in the yachts, and it's all about how they treat their employees well, and they treat, you know, they're sympathetic and understanding, and that's, in a way, he's sort of saying, well, here's the happiest characters in the entire book, and yet we have such a different response from everything else in the book. And I'm not sure if Hemingway was trying to say something with that or not. And I think I'm failing at what I'm trying to get at here.
Hemingway is actually chided or criticized for not thinking about the issues of race, not thinking about the content, the class issues, something that he didn't do.
The only thing that I would say, and maybe we'll get more into this in the main topic, but there is the closing, basically Harry's last words.
Yeah.
Which is, one man alone ain't got it. No man alone now. No matter how a man alone ain't got no bloody fucking chance. Now, and I don't know if that is a statement about had he trusted other people about more earlier in the book, he wouldn't have resulted in his death. I'm not sure. But that's his dying words, and maybe that means something. I also wanted to go back to this idea of whether or not Morgan is a hero, because I don't think he's a hero at all. He's definitely an anti-hero.
Yeah.
Yes, and on the back of the copy of the book that I read, they say, the dramatic story of Harry Morgan, an honest man who is forced into running contraband. Okay,
yeah.
Well, that doesn't work, because in the very first section of the book, he considers, even though he kills Mr. Singh, and there's a reason for that, sort of, he's like killing one to save 12. He also considers, when Eddie sneaks on board the boat, he's basically going to kill Eddie and throw him overboard because he didn't put his name on the paperwork. So rather than paying a fine, he's just going to murder this guy. That doesn't sound like an honest man to me.
No, he sounds like a sociopath.
I think we just need to make that clear, that Morgan is not a hero. He's a guy out to support himself, certainly, but he's a murdering racist as well.
Classic, sort of a hard-boiled pulp anti-hero. I do like that last line. That was something that he had heard somewhere, and I forgot the context. But
yeah, so there's a lot to think about when it comes to this book, and for that reason alone, I would encourage our listeners to read it before we talk more about it here in part 2. You know, think about this character, think about the social context of what was going on in the world when Hemingway wrote this, and if you've read Hemingway, certainly, more extensively, or some of his more well-known works, think about how that compares to this one as you're reading it. And we'll discuss, this a little bit, quite a bit more deeply in part 2 of the episode.
Definitely. And I look forward to that. So, all right. Coming up in future episodes, we have episode 20, Cormac McCarthy's No Country for Old Men. We're currently on the border between the Keys and Cuba. Next, we're going to be on the border between Texas and Mexico. I love that story. I especially love the movie, but the novel itself is very strong, and I look forward to that. Following that, we begin our long-planned trip around the world, noir around the world, with episode 21. We visit the Mediterranean, specifically Marseille, France, and also a little bit of North Africa with Jean-Claude Izzo's Total Chaos. Following that, we head south, episode 22, to Nigeria in West Africa, where we visit My Sister, the Serial Killer by Oyinkan Brathwaite. And those are two I'm very excited about exploring, including the other noir of the regions. And then from there, we move on to Japan, Brazil, and Mexico, but we'll save that for another time. How do folks contact us, Kurt?
Well, they can contact us a number of ways, but don't forget about that Patreon if you're interested in helping back the show. And another thing to let you know is we are now available on YouTube. If that is something that you'd prefer to listen to us in a video format, I guess. We do have future plans to do something special with our YouTube channel. We'll see how that goes. In the meantime, you can get a hold of us at Facebook at Point Blank, Hardboiled Noir and Detective Fiction. You can send us an email at pointblanknoir@gmail.com. You can tweet us at pointblanknoir, and we're also on Instagram.
Yeah, I post a picture every once in a while. We're not really good with that, but be our friend and give us recommendations how we can make that better.
And don't forget our Goodreads group. Go to Goodreads, search groups for Point Blank, and you'll find a community of other listeners there who will be interested in discussing these books with you. We have, I believe, around 60 members right now, and it's not a very high traffic site. Just a couple posts a week, so it's easy to keep up with.
Yeah, but we do want your questions, your comments, your theories on some of the books we're reading. We will, if you have something good to say, we will share it on the show, and it will contribute to our overall discussion. So please speak your mind.
That's right. And we'll see you next time. Bye-bye for now.
Ciao.
Point Blank is under a Creative Commons license. Music is by Justin. Copywritten works are property of their respective holders.